Good evening, everyone, and welcome back once again to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. And we are in the middle of a study on Matthew 24, and we are going to share some more thoughts on verse 29 with you this evening. So if you recall from our last few videos, we've tried to demonstrate that in Matthew 24:29, where Jesus prophesied the darkening of the sun, the falling of the stars, the moon not shedding its light, he was quoting primarily two Old Testament prophecies. Ezekiel chapter 32, 7 and 8, which was prophetic of the judgment of Egypt by Babylon, and he quoted Isaiah 13, verse 10, which was a prophecy of Babylon's destruction by the Medo-Persian Empire. And we've also tried to demonstrate that one of the reasons why Jesus quoted those specific prophecies, the judgment of Egypt and the judgment of Babylon, was because in the first century, Old Covenant Jerusalem had become spiritual Egypt and spiritual Babylon. They had become the enslavers and the persecutors of God's covenant people, and they would be judged as such. They would be judged as the enemies of Jehovah. Now, what I want to do in this video is build upon last video where we demonstrated specifically that Old Covenant Jerusalem had become spiritual Babylon. Remember, we demonstrated that through the doctrine of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. In Revelation, Babylon the Great, the city turned harlot, was guilty of shedding the blood of the apostles and prophets, and in her was found all of the blood of all the righteous shed upon the earth. And God was going to remember her in that judgment, a covenantal remembrance, and pour out his wrath upon Babylon for shedding the blood of his saints. Well, Jesus in Matthew 23 identified Old Covenant Jerusalem as the city who had shed the blood of the apostles, the blood of the Old Testament prophets, and the blood of all the saints that had been shed upon the earth, from Abel to Zacharias. And the judgment of Jerusalem for shedding the blood of the righteous would come upon Old Covenant Israel in the first century generation, in Jesus' generation. That means that Babylon of Revelation was Old Covenant Jerusalem, who was guilty of shedding the blood of the righteous, and they would be judged for that persecution and for the murder of the righteous in AD 70. And that's what Matthew 24 is all about. If you remember way back to our introductory videos, this judgment, the destruction of the temple and the city, is a covenantal judgment primarily for the vindication of the blood of the martyrs. And what I want to do in this video, once again, is I want to go back to Isaiah 13 and show you some parallels where this language and some of the themes that are being worked out through the judgment of Babylon, we can find those same themes and that same language being employed and imputed to Old Covenant Jerusalem and the judgment that will come upon them in AD 70. So let's do this, and let's identify further that Old Covenant Jerusalem in the first century was in fact Babylon of Revelation. Let's do this. Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 8. Concerning the judgment of Babylon, Isaiah says, they will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. I'll stop right there. So when Babylon was judged, they would writhe like a woman in labor. It would be like labor pains coming upon them. Well, that is Matthew 24, verse 7 and 8. Watch this. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So when Babylon was judged, it would be as birth pangs coming upon them. But when Old Covenant Jerusalem would be judged, and when that tribulation would come upon them, that would be as birth pangs upon a woman. Perfect parallel. Go back to Isaiah chapter 13. Let's look at another one. Let's read verses 9 to 11 of Isaiah 13. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. That's Matthew 24:29, of course. But watch the next verse. Thus I will punish the world for its evil. I'm going to stop right there. Notice that Isaiah connects the darkening of the constellations with the judgment of the world at the judgment of Babylon. Why? Because Babylon represented the world power. They ruled the world of that time. And remember, sun, moon, stars were symbolic imagery for powers, rulers, authorities, and nations all throughout the Old Testament scriptures. So the darkening of the sun and the moon and the stars at the judgment of Babylon was the judgment of that world. It was the judgment of Babylon's world, the world of that day. Well, let's apply that theme to Matthew 24. Concerning the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem in AD 70, Jesus said the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from heaven. And then in verse 35, he said, heaven and earth will pass away. You see, he connected the passing away of heaven and earth with the darkening of the constellations at the destruction of Old Covenant Jerusalem. Why? Because they were God's covenant nation. They ruled through covenants the world of that day. Not physically, not militarily, but covenantally. They were God's instrument and his vehicle for his covenant grace and his covenant redemption to the world. And the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem in AD 70 was the judgment of the covenant world. It was the darkening of the constellations. And we can see this in other New Testament scriptures. Consider Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In verse 26, he talks about the present distress. And in verse 39, he says the form of this world is passing away. See, the form of Judaism, the form of the Old Covenant system was passing away through the present distress, the tribulation that was coming upon that generation. And in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16 to 17, the Apostle John says, don't follow the world, the lust of flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, it's of the world, and the world is passing away. You see, that old covenant system, that cosmos, was passing away. And that's exactly what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. When the old covenant world would pass away, that would be the darkening of the suns, the falling of the stars, etc. Perfect parallel. When Babylon was judged, in Isaiah chapter 13, it was the darkening of the constellations and the judgment of the world. When Old Covenant Jerusalem was judged in the first century, it was the darkening of the cosmos, and it was the judgment and the removal of that covenant world. Beautiful parallels. Go back with me to Isaiah chapter 13. Let's look at another one. In verse 13 and verse 13. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place. So at the judgment of Babylon, the earth would tremble, and heaven will be shaken from its place. That's the shaking of the heavens and earth. Well, number one, we see that in Matthew 24, verse 29. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. But we also see that in Hebrews chapter 12, which is the context of the removal of the old covenant world, Judaism. The writer of Hebrews says, yet now once and I will shake not only heaven, but earth. And the shaking of the old covenant world was the removal of Judaism. And that removal of Judaism, took place at the judgment of Old Covenant Israel in AD 70. But that was the shaking of heaven and earth. So when Babylon was judged, heaven and earth would be shaken. When Old Covenant Israel was judged and destroyed and removed, that would be the shaking of heaven and earth. Perfect parallel. Let's look at one more, just for time's sake, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 19. And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of Chaldees' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So when Babylon was judged, it would be as the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, consider Jesus' words in Luke chapter 17, which is a parallel discourse to Matthew 24. Watch this, Luke 17, verses 28 to 30. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. You see, this revealing of the Son of Man is parallel to Matthew 24:3, the coming of the Son of Man. Okay? They asked him, what shall be the sign of your coming? And his coming would be at the destruction of the temple and Judaism, the destruction of Israel. And by combining Luke 17 and Matthew 24, when the Son of Man would come at the destruction of Jerusalem, it would be as the judgment of Sodom and the judgment of Gomorrah. But in Isaiah, the judgment of Babylon would be as the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Therefore, Old Covenant Israel is Babylon of Isaiah 13, and spiritual Babylon of Revelation, chapters 16 through 19. Listen, we have perfect thematic parallels. Old covenant Israel in the first century had become spiritual Babylon, and they would be judged for their persecution and their enslavery of God's people. And as I'll show you next video, from Jeremiah chapter 50-51, Old covenant Israel had become Babylon, and they had become the defiler of the temple, and they would be judged for that too. But we'll show you that next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.